Welcome to the Bilgepumps, where a bunch of drips start ship.
Hello, and welcome to a very, very new form of bilge pumps, or rather, a sort of continued form of bilge pumps. We all love naval history, and that's what brings us together, and normally we're discussing current affairs. But occasionally, we've decided from now on, we're going to take on a couple of projects, which we're going to do via the medium of YouTube videos, shared mainly on mine and Drax's channel, because Jamie claims that they shouldn't go on his. But this one is going to be on Taranto, because it's the 80th anniversary of a very famous carrier airstrike, which really did set the world alight, but also is open to some areas of debate, which we think will be quite interesting to get into. So we're going to be doing this as in-depth. I hesitate to say documentary style, because the three of us are going to be talking a lot, and it's a lot more relaxed than a documentary. So maybe if it is a documentary style, it's a Top Gear, old Top Gear that does documentary style.
Yeah, a waffle.
Good syrup.
Yeah. Oh, look, Taranto is one of those stories that everyone knows a little bit about, but in reality, they don't know anything at all. They know that it involved antique biplanes. They know that
Which were antiques.
They know that it was a surprise attack on an Italian harbour, and they know that they, hit a few battleships, and that's pretty much where it ends. And also, of course, they know that it inspired the Japanese to raid Pearl Harbor. Well, that's the picture that's sort of wrapped up in one or two sentences in most World War II compendiums. There's an awful lot more behind it and around it that really reveals just how nothing ever just happens in war. An action is always a focal point of years, if not decades, of thinking, of building, of designing, of planning, of practicing. And it either comes together or it doesn't.
Well, it's the thing is with Taranto, is we sit there and go, this is the first major naval airstrike on fleet in harbour, and then you go, well, actually, the Royal Navy was planning on using HMS Furious in one of her earlier forms, and Sopwith Cuckoos, the first generation of torpedo or egg-laying biplanes, to do this in World War I. So when it happens in 1940, that is amazing. But it's also, and it's treated as this big revelation of naval aviation coming of age. But it's not a concept which is new or hasn't been being looked at seriously for the previous 22 odd years.
Well, I was going to say that it's not a unique idea. It's not a new idea. It's it's 1932, Fleet Problem 13. Pearl Harbor was attacked by Saratoga and Lexington. The Fleet Problem assumed that his battleship force would be sweeping into the waters around Pearl Harbor. Well, instead he sent his carriers on ahead, so that they arrived far earlier, even though they were only lightly escorted by destroyers, who launched a raid on the harbour, and all the judges determined a overwhelming victory before the battleships even got to sea. So this is 1932. They did it again in 1938. They had another fleet problem where basically they did the same thing. They didn't learn their first lesson in Pearl Harbor.
No.
And they did it again against San Francisco. So the United States Navy was well and truly on top of the idea of carrier aviation airstrikes against remote, well-defended naval bases.
Were they, though? Because they were very good at doing them to themselves, but they weren't very good at realizing other people might be able to do them. It's this classic problem of, because we have the ability to do it, we presume other people can't or won't.
Or is it more a matter of refusing to actually learn the lessons being taught?
Well,
The fact that the same things repeated several times over would suggest that. Sorry.
I think it's also a combination of with the US Navy, of who are they facing? Because whilst they are thinking about taking on both, well, they got war plans to fight everybody, including the Girl Scouts. But in terms of people,
the Girl Scouts would have won a vicious victory.
Yeah.
Never put down the threat of those cookies. They are lethal.
Shuriken cookie hits the magazine. But yeah, when it came to people who could launch an air assault, period, of any particular scale, they basically only had to worry about the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy. And as far as they were concerned, the Royal Navy wasn't particularly interested in going after the US Pacific Fleet bases. They were much more, if it came to a war, the UK would be much more interested in going after the Atlantic Fleet bases, which are a completely different setup. And when it came to the Japanese, as I've covered in the video there were the two videos where I cooperated with Justin Pike on the A6M0, the US was coming off of a phase of extreme racism within their intelligence community, to the point that they flat out refused to believe that the Japanese could do anything themselves. They thought every aircraft that they had was a copy of a Western aircraft. They thought that every ship the Japanese had was a copy of a Western ship. They thought all the technology they had were illegally or legally bought copies of Western technologies. And the US intelligence community generally seemed to be completely incapable of believing that, as they term it, a yellow race was capable in any way, shape, or form of anything like advanced tactical thinking. So
this does not remind me of the conversations we currently have over China at all, in any way, stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and the one or two American officers who actually said, well, maybe they are actually doing things for themselves, were basically shouted down by the preponderance of everybody else, going, no, they're just unable to do anything. And that was even to the point of, by the time Japan was sort of closing up to foreign observation, you had sort of naval attaches and such who physically weren't allowed access to Japanese naval bases or air bases, and were just writing home, yes, the Japanese are still maintaining their continued policy of copying Western technology. And when you look into, there's a lot of waffle and restatements of previous reports, but when you actually look into the substance of the reports through the mid to late 1930s, it's quite evident that most of these naval attaches haven't been outside the four walls of their compound, and yet they're still repeating this. So when it comes to an attack on Pearl Harbor, or I suppose for a lot of the 1930s, an attack on San Diego, which perhaps is more understandable, you don't think that anyone can stage carriers out to there. But in either case, the Americans are sitting there going, well, we, as the superior race, can do this, but we're the only ones who can do this. Everyone else is either too far away or too inferior.
One thing, though, there we've got to admit that by 1940, they had their attaches outside of their four walls, and one of them was on board HMS Illustrious during the raid on Taranto. So, one thing that happened from the very start of the war in Europe was that the United States said, whether or not this is legal doesn't matter. We really must learn quickly from the realities of war as opposed to the theory of war. That's what the objective was, and whether or not that was actually the case and will determine by the end of this episode, I suspect. But look, when it comes to the British, Britain also, the Royal Navy had also been mucking around with the idea of, striking harbours. The origins of the idea of the raid against Taranto was first drawn up in 1935 during the Abyssinian crisis, which was a League of Nations-led dispute over Italy's, is it fair to call it an invasion of Libya?
Yes, but I would also say that it wasn't first drawn up then. That's when the first time it's drawn up under the auspices of the Mediterranean Fleet, officially. Because the reason I say that is because, of course, in 1930, the Royal Navy appoints his first Rear Admiral aircraft carriers. And he goes through several things. We know he produces several design studies. We can't really find many contents of them. I can find the orders of the design studies and the staff, those groups he starts off, but I can't. The reports haven't been saved, apparently, in the National Archives for posterity. So at some point, I'm going to be screaming at a wall. But leaving that to one side, he also starts doing a lot of codifying a lot of operational planning, because up to that point, the aircraft carriers have been grouped in for planning reasons with the battle cruisers. And so it'd been the staff of the battle cruiser squadron who'd been responsible for doing the plans for the aviation attacks. And they were quite good, but mostly they were orientated around the cruiser carrier role and the sea control role and the scouting role. It's in 1930 that with a Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, which is Rear Admiral Henderson at this point, it's unsurprising. I do know what Henderson I do bring up quite a lot, but he's quite important to this whole story, gets involved. And first things first is he compiles a list of all potential primary enemy fleet bases, and they start working through them on attack. So when you're talking about the plans which the Mediterranean fleet is drawing up during the Abyssinian crisis, they already have some plan and some staff work sitting on file to base somewhere from stuff from. And also, the Royal Navy has been, every time they go for a port visit, they take photographs. It's lovely. There's lots of people waving in them. And it looks great. But you have to remember those photographs, as well as being lovely mementos of their beautiful visit to a lovely port of Taranto, are also very useful for planning strikes and attacks. Because infrastructure, whilst you can do certain things to it, you can't really change that rapidly, the basic layout. You can't recite a fuel storage site. You cannot easily. You cannot recite the big, heavy things easily. You can't change the spaces which are deep enough and strong enough for a battleship to be moored at. Because let's be honest, if you consider the Queen Elizabeth class aircraft carriers, why was so much money invested in Portsmouth before we could build, as we were building them, to build up the infrastructure so there actually is a wharf that is capable of supporting and sustaining those two ships. They are very large, very heavy. That's nothing new. Battleships were also very large, very heavy. There are limited spaces they can be. If you've got pictures of those spaces, it doesn't matter if they're 5 years old or 10 years old. Those pictures are probably still going to be valid, because it's unlikely anyone's going to have the money to recite whole battleship storage positions.
And of course, I suppose what happened in 1935 was it suddenly became almost a reality. So you had your Admiral of the Mediterranean Fleet sitting there between Italy and Libya with his 3 aircraft carriers, discovering that the tempo of almost combat conditions was having a pretty heavy effect on the availability of his aircraft, and wondering how on earth can he get maximum bang for his buck. He was convinced that he would be going to war against Italy, that the order could come at any time. He and his leading staff were determined to get in the first strike in order to, set up an advantageous position. And the idea was very rapidly floated that, well, let's do a surprise attack on Taranto. A few months later, it became evident that no, the League of Nations wasn't going to, shall we say, get grumpy about what had happened.
Do anything at all. Have some teeth.
Yeah, and Britain didn't want to do it alone.
No.
So they stood down, and the
Britain was facing Japan, all sorts of issues at the moment. Why do they want to pick a war with Italy if no one else really wants to get in there?
Well, anyway, the point is that the command staff had sat down and worked out a rough breakdown of what was needed in order to conduct a surprise attack on Taranto.
Mm-hmm.
And that was put in a safe and forgotten about. But then along came another crisis. I think it was 1938 this time.
Mm.
And this time was HMS Glorious, whose captain is a character who will feature once again regularly in today's chat, Captain Lumley St. George Lister.
Yes.
And he was summoned aboard HMS Queen Elizabeth to discuss with Admiral Dudley Pound how to hurt the Italian Navy the most. They pulled out the old Abyssinian crisis notes and decided to take it one step further. So Lister returned to Glorious, pulled his air group together and said, okay, how do we turn this into a reality? So I guess what happened there was, they decided that, okay, we need to do this at night because otherwise we can't get close enough and there's not much chance of aircraft surviving during the day. And the only way for a attack to be effective is if it's by torpedo. So they basically, at that point, drew the mud map for the actual attack that took place in 1940. They determined that they would need airdrop flares, both to illuminate the site plus to act as a distraction for the heavy anti-aircraft weaponry. And HMS Glorious's command staff did the maths and came back with a casualty rate estimation of 10%, which Admiral Pound apparently laughed at and said, no way, I don't think we're going to, I think a mission like this will be prohibitively damaging to our air arm. And so he decided that, no, this idea is not appropriate. Lock it back up in the safe, and I'm not even going to mention it to Whitehall. So
what I find interesting is this is the same Admiral Pound, who likes to order his ships to play chicken as a way to make the officers be more alert and aggressive. And when I say play chicken, he actually, at one point, when he has the Greek Prime Minister aboard, or Greek King aboard, HMS Warspite, he orders the cruiser HMS Arethusa, which is under Rear Admiral Lionel. I've forgotten his surname, but the captain is Philip Vian, and they're 5 miles ahead on a direct bearing, as they normally are when they're escorting the flagship. And he orders them to turn around and come back as close to Warspite as they can, giving them a heading which would put them directly on top of Warspite. And they do come back and they basically swamp Warspite. They're going so close and the water's so fast. And Warspite is relatively so much lower in the water than the Arethusa class light cruiser. And you sit there and go, if he considers that is a perfectly fine thing to do, to risk HMS Warspite, one of the few modernized battleships available that is really, really good, and the brand new light cruiser, why does he, which would probably cost several thousand, probably cost about 1,000 lives if they actually collided, but he reckons the Fleet Air Arm would be too high risk an operation. He's doing one thing for kicks, and that's not a high risk thing to do. And the actual operational necessity thing is too high risk.
Yeah, I suppose, but you also got to remember that this is just a couple of years after they discovered that you very rapidly go through your aircraft just from operating at a combat tempo. And if that happens, then all of a sudden you have a nice shiny new aircraft carrier sitting in dock because you don't have any aircraft to use. So I have a suspicion that sort of thing was part of this thinking at this point. I mean, the Glorious practiced this attack. They did raids against Alexandria Harbour at night. An easy matter. It's not something that any pilot could do. They had to be prepared. So I guess if you've got such a highly trained group of people and you throw them away in one mission, you've got the rest of the war to worry about.
One of the other interesting things going on in 1938, though, is you do have, so at the same time as this was going on, Caspar John, who later on would go on to become a First Sea Lord, but is one of the more famous and more prominent naval aviators and naval aviation people in the 1930s. He's coming up through the ranks. He's a captain sort of by 1938. He's actually been sent to America as part of, and this is the reason I got this book out, it's the government air mission to the States, or rather the Weir mission, son of William Weir, that was headed by James Weir, who was son of William Weir, who'd been prominent among those who tried to keep the Fleet Air Arm combined with the Royal Air Force, but they'd failed. And Caspar John is sent as the Fleet Air Arm representative in 1938, because the decision has been made in 1938. It won't be implemented until 1939, but the decision has now been made that the Fleet Air Arm is going to be separate. And he's going over the America alongside Air Commodore Bomber Harris, and to study the procurement in the USA of aircraft manufacturing. One of the interesting things is they conclude, while they're over there for this study, looking at the American aircraft, is that America are designing very good, very rugged aircraft, but they're not, in their view, suitable for long-range flight at night because their controls are quite complicated and they are not carrying the same safety equipment, i.e. life preservers and life rafts and those sort of things, and other facilities, that the British aircraft are being fitted with. So it's kind of interesting. That gives you context in 1938. The British and the Americans are already having a lot of discussions going on, a lot of things going on, which will lead up to what takes place later in World War II. But the British aircraft in 1938 are considered better for what the British want to do with them than the American aircraft because of some very simple things. It's not the aircraft controls are complicated for night flying. And it's interesting, Caspar John is the one to know this because he's a pilot who has actually been one of the ones who's really pushed and pioneered night flying on various operations in the Royal Navy in the 1920s and 30s and worked with a lot. There are very similar names keep coming up in this this story. Caspar John won't feature in it much because he's off dealing with other things. But Caspar John, Lumley Lister, Philip Vian are all involved in various things at the sort of nascence of the naval aviation, and they're all, to an extent, lesser or greater extent, proteges of Admiral Henderson and Admiral Cunningham. Those are the sort of the officers who really will be promoting them and pushing them up their careers. And it's interesting to note that that's what's going on. This is the group which we're talking about now, and they're having a big impact before the war's even begun, before this evening show. They are having an impact in what's going to take place.
I think one of the things that probably has a bearing on the judgment about how many aircraft they think they're going to lose, and obviously, as you say, the attrition, therefore, on the trained aircrew, is the fact that pre-World War II, everybody was massively overestimating just how effective anti-aircraft gunfire was going to be. So they're probably running those simulations and those estimates based on the usual Royal Navy idea of, well, we know our anti-aircraft weapons are, well, we think we know our anti-aircraft weapons are so and so effective, and we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the enemies are approximately as effective, and therefore we would lose X number of aircraft even with a night attack. And then, obviously, as it turns out, no one's AA guns. I don't know what it is with anti-aircraft weapon systems, but pretty much ever since their inception, they've been some of the most dramatically oversold systems on the planet.
It's the fear of the air power, and it's the fact it's the best-selling thing, but also it's what they're tested against, because if you consider anti-aircraft weapons tend to be tested against remote-controlled versions of older aircraft types, if they're actually tested against a real thing at all, rather than just simulated, as some have been. And you sit there and go, yes, but that aircraft is remote-controlled, flying level, and it's not doing the latest things. But there's a reason for doing that. Would you want to test your missile against your brand new, all singing, all dancing F-22, or I'm thinking the Russian equivalent? Would you manned by a pilot? Would you really want to test your air system against that? Because if you succeed, great, you've proved your air system. You've also killed a very expensive aircraft, which is going to be difficult to replace, and possibly some pilots.
Fit a paintball warhead. That would be funny. But no, I do recall actually one of the incidents I read about in the late 1930s when they were trying to test, I believe it was they just finished installing some of the HAX Mark III anti-aircraft fire directors, and they flew a Queen Bee remote control biplane through the Mediterranean fleet, and everyone was happily blazing away. It flew straight and level at about 1,000 feet, came out the other side completely untouched. So they sent it back through again, trying to figure out what was going on. And at the very, very end, the poor thing just disintegrated from a direct hit. And they were like, oh, that works. And then it turned out in the after action report, the reason it had disintegrated was because some clever individual on one of the first Dido class to commission had, after the first run through, just gone, this is stupid, disabled the fire control director, and and I think C turret was firing under local control. And the guy had literally, the fire control person in the turret had literally just gone, one round, okay, correct. Second round, correct. He was literally doing it like a rapid fire version of a sea engagement. He was just firing off single shots and then correcting, and then at the end scoring a direct hit. And turns out 5.25-inch shell scoring a direct hit doesn't do good things to an aircraft. But everyone's like, yeah, your hacks works. And there's this one guy sitting in a cruiser going, no, I'm just that good.
One thing I will say, I'll just add this in for the later video. Jamie, is it the same thing, or does Drac kind of look like he's got a halo at the moment?
Yes,
Has he been blessed?
He looks quite heavenly at the moment, yes.
The sun has emerged, and now it's going away again.
Anyway, so here we are, June 10, 1940. Italy enters the war. There's a problem, though. The French aren't there.
The French are always a problem. Even
So
when they
all the
are they're a problem. In the nicest way. I love the French involvement in World War II. Basically, it's non-stop meetings. Every time you have the French involved in something, it seems to quadruple the number of meetings you have to have. They do great work, but it's kind of like the Italians when we talk about the Italian Navy. The lower levels are excellent. The senior admirals were not quite sure about. The French, the admirals of these things, they're all sort of much of a muchness. This is one admiral who we won't go into, who Drac really, really doesn't like and really thinks shouldn't have been in this post and should possibly have been shot at birth. But leaving that to one side, no matter how good they are, wherever the French are, turn up, army, navy, whoever, the meetings multiply. I don't know what it is.
And to be perfectly honest, when we're talking about an attack on Taranto, the Royal Navy wouldn't have lowered itself to including Bern in the operation. So if they were going,
they probably wouldn't have needed to attack Taranto. Let's face it. I mean, up until that point, the Italian superiority on paper was overwhelming, because when war was declared, I think there was only 2 British battleships in the Mediterranean. Naturally, that changed very quickly, but Glorious was no longer in the Mediterranean, despite spending most of her career there. This was the ship that was best trained, best practiced at the art of night harbour attack. Although, admittedly, some of her crew had just dispersed, but she was up trying to help in the North Sea, and then was
Royal was fairly good and fairly well trained if she'd been used properly.
To be honest, if the French, even if the French Navy had still been around, I personally still think the Taranto attack would have needed to have happened, because if you think about what ships would the French have had available at this point. So we're talking early 1941. So Richelieu probably would have finished commissioning. Jean Bart is probably still under construction, possibly just about pushing commissioning, but it's definitely not in active service. So you got one fast battleship that's probably can go toe to toe with the Littorios, but the Italians have Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. And then you've got Dunkirk and Strasbourg, but with the two Scharnhorsts around and Bismarck about to commission, everyone's probably going to want the Dunkirks over in the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean, because Dunkirk and Strasbourg would be very good at dealing with the Deutschland class, and Strasbourg at least probably decent at dealing with the Scharnhorsts. So assuming that everyone's happy to leave dealing with Bismarck to King George V and Hood and the newly commissioning Prince of Wales, realistically the French capital ship commitment to the Mediterranean is probably going to be made up of Richelieu, who'll either be operating out of Toulon or possibly with Force H, at which point the Italians still have 2-1 in fast battleships, and they've got their 4 modernized World War I ships versus the 3 modernized World War I ships that Cunningham's got. And does anyone really want to take the Britannias out against anything that can shoot back?
Also, let's be honest, if you'd had the French, then you wouldn't have had Force H there, because it would have been Force K further down the coast. That's the thing. Force K gets turned into Force H because of the French going out the war. So you'd have had Force K, which is round the coast down in Freetown, I think they're mainly operating from. Yeah. So they would have probably, Force K might have been moved up when the Italians entered the war, but they become Force H when they're strengthened and grown quite dramatically and move commands, because they're not sure if they're going to get rid of Force K. So they basically take Force K's forces, turn them into Force H, keep Force K running on paper until they're sure they don't need it. Then it gets disbanded and becomes the Malta Force, but that's something for later. I think whatever happens, no matter how strong, even if they do have Dunkirk and Strasbourg and they have all these things put in the Mediterranean, I still think the British do Taranto, because in the nicest way, this is the Royal Navy's modus operandi. Why, if we have a plan that can take out the enemy fleet before we have to fight them, before they can cause any trouble, because if you take them out, then you don't have to worry so much about when they're going to come out and attack your convoys. You are reducing the threat to your convoys to Malta. You are reducing the threat to your convoys going around the Mediterranean while you're fighting in North Africa. You're making your ability to attack their convoys that much stronger. You take out the enemy's core. Now, I have to admit, I think if the French had been in, I think the difference that would have been the case is I think you might well have had, if there had been a Force H and there had been an Ark Royal there, I think the attack which Ark Royal takes part in Genoa might have been moved, and you might have had more of an effort to combine the Ark Royal and illustrious Eagle, if it was still working, to form a far larger strike on Taranto, with Bern perhaps providing the Genoa distraction attack, because let's be honest, while the Royal Navy probably wouldn't have wanted Bern anywhere near its task groups, it wouldn't have minded letting Bern go off and do a distraction attack on its own, because, again, as far as the Royal Navy be concerned, if Bern gets sunk, whilst we're very sorry, we don't ever want to lose an aircraft carrier, it's kind of like losing HMS Argus. We'd be sorry to lose it. We don't want to lose it, but on the cost of things, losing Ark Royal, losing Glorious, losing Courageous, those were big problems, which Royal Navy in the 1930s and in 1939 and 1940, if I could go back in time and have a conversation with you, I would be. You do not do that with your aircraft carriers.
And strategically as well, I mean, to be honest, the thing is, like, even if we were really, really, really generous and said that Jean Bart's commissioned and maybe Strasbourg gets kicked over to the Mediterranean fleet, so you've got Richelieu, Strasbourg, Jean Bart and Cunningham's 3 battleships, that still only really puts you on a par with the Regia Marina, at which point, as Cunningham was already having to do historically, you would have had the Allied naval force having to operate together as a single unit, just in case the Italians deploy in force, which limits their tactical flexibility. Whereas if you knock out part of the Italian fleet at Taranto, again, as happened historically, but even more so with an Allied force, you're then able to operate multiple tactical groups because you only have to worry about the Italians coming out with 1 or 2 ships.
Regardless, so Cunningham was trying to pick a fight.
Mm.
He got his battle at Calabria, but was rather frustrated that he couldn't draw the Italian fleet into a direct gun duel.
Mm-hmm.
Calabria was an interesting one because that's the aftermath of Calabria was where Eagle started to suffer her problems. HMS Eagle. She suffered quite a lot of high altitude bombing and a lot of near misses, and these unseated the aviation fuel systems supplying the hangars and decks. So that was a problem in terms of contamination of aviation fuel, but it was also a cause of leaking fuel pipes and like throughout the ship. And ultimately, as that got worse with every near miss and every big wave. And by the time the deadline for Taranto came around, she just was potentially a floating bomb.
And
so
let's be honest, she's a 22-year-old ship. She's been worked hard all her life because she was pretty much the first proper carrier the Royal Navy had in so many ways. She's been used again and again and again and again for so many different training exercises in peacetime, worked hard for those years. And the whole point was they had been planning on replacing her. She was due to be replaced. If World War II hadn't happened, let's say it had happened it started in 1941 or 1942, as the British had been thinking it would, Eagle probably wouldn't have been in service. She'd have been gone, replaced by one of the armored hangar carriers of the Illustrious class, or possibly even HMS Unicorn. You know, there are all sorts of options of what she'd been replaced by. So this is a ship very much at the end of her life, and she's now in the middle. She's been plunged into a world war, and she doesn't have a quiet 1939 and 1940 before this by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I mean, look, Eagle during 1940 is pretty much, again, proves the value of having a carrier along. This is one of the stories associated with Eagle is she had a air group completely comprised of swordfish until the captain and head of the air wing remembered that there was a couple of crated training sea gladiators nearby. So it was a story very similar to that of Malta, where, these single-seat trainers, combat-capable single-seat trainers, are quite handy. Let's assemble them and appropriate them as our fighter group. So she ended up carrying about up to six, I think, sea gladiators as well, even though they weren't formally a part of her air group at the start of proceedings.
And of course, the Royal Navy has no history of randomly acquiring aircraft from, we had these aircraft, we didn't know it. And of course, there is no similarity between those sea gladiators and any sea harriers you might see wandering around Yeovilton and Culdrose. Nothing is similar between those at all. There is no similarities.
Back to the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
So here we have Admiral Cunningham, new admiral in charge of the Mediterranean. He's looking for a fight.
Yes.
But he's not in a position to go all out. So things change when HMS Illustrious arrives.
Yes, then he can go looking for a fight.
It changes for two reasons. One, he actually gets a fleet carrier as opposed to, I suppose you can call Eagle a light fleet carrier.
I would call it a cruiser carrier more, because that's really what her air group's orientated around. If you consider it, look, her air group's orientated around originally around Swordfish, which, whilst they are torpedo, spotter, reconnaissance, if whilst that's the whole aircraft, they've got one air group. It's more if that's what your air group can do, that's more a cruiser carrier's role, because a cruiser carrier isn't expecting to deal with large enemy carriers alone. It's expecting to be doing a lot of spotting for cruisers, a lot of reconnaissance to find enemy surface raiders, and the fact it has torpedoes, that's quite useful for slowing down enemy surface raiders if you spot them and find them. So it's a cruiser carrier in its air group, and that's very much what it has been being used as during the interwar period.
Anyway, so Illustrious is there. It's not just that they've got a carrier that can carry 30 to 40 useful aircraft. On board that carrier is Rear Admiral Lister.
Mm-hmm.
And the Admiral Pound had the good grace to tell Admiral Cunningham, as he handed over command of the Mediterranean, of these notes that he had in his safe about Taranto.
Mm-hmm.
So the instant Illustrious arrives, Cunningham has Lister over to his flagship. Illustrious's carrier captain was Captain Boyd, and he is fairly significant, not just because he was captain of the Illustrious, but he was also quite heavily involved in the design and production of the duplex pistol for the torpedoes that they were using. Now, so these 18-inch lightweight air-carried torpedoes had a secret weapon, and that was a warhead that was designed to go off underneath the hull as opposed to a direct contact, although it had contact fuse as well. And this was going to be pretty much the debut of this new weapon.
That wasn't the only secret weapon they had. Those torpedoes also had, and this was part of the reasons why the Swordfish was chosen and was such a good aircraft for the Navy this time, was they had a little reel on them which had a tension cable on it. And that cable made sure that the torpedo, instead of nose diving into the water, belly flopped, so it would run shallower. This was very, very critical in order to achieving being able to attack in harbours. It's a very simple idea, it's a very effective idea, but the only nation which does it is the Royal Navy. Everyone else tries to play around with different ideas. And the thing is, so you've got this torpedo, the torpedo which the Swordfish are going to be using in this attack, is a marriage of both a very, very high-tech, very innovative thinking duplex pistol system and a very low-tech but devastatingly effective tension system, which anyone could really work out in order to make sure those torpedoes do not dive so deep that they hit the bottom of the harbour or anything like that. How do I put this? It's sort of, we can get so focused on the high tech stuff we forget the low tech, which can make it really, really work. And that's what I love about this whole system. The British have gone really, really high tech in developing the warhead, and then have looked at it, and they could have gone with fancy fins and all sorts of things and wings or all sorts of things, but they actually go, hang on, what's the most simple way of making this work? What's the most simple, reliable way of making this work? Oh, tension cable. And that's what they go with. So they go with this sort of dual approach of what's the best solution for this problem? Not necessarily what is the most high-tech solution available, but what is the best solution available to this problem? And the Royal Navy doesn't always do that. I'm not saying the Royal Navy is unique in doing this, but it does have this moment in this wing of doing that. And when a Navy does manage to, or an organization does manage to have that moment, they need to be called out and celebrated, because that's always good. As Drac, our resident engineer, would say, the chance of getting people to go with the sensible low-tech option is often very, very difficult versus selling them on the high-tech fancy thing which needs to be developed.
It also shows that the RN had been thinking about this for a long time. The flex pistol doesn't come out of nowhere. The tension wire doesn't come out of nowhere. They are there because they've been thinking about this as a challenge for 5, 10, 15 years, if not more.
I'd go
And
2020. I'd go. They've been thinking about this. Honestly, the Royal Navy's been thinking about attacking fleets in harbour since World War One, when they had the. And this is the thing: you are dealing with a legacy of World War One, but it's not Jutland. This is the trouble. We always, whenever we're talking about World War Two and the legacy in people's minds of what World War One's, everyone's thinking about Jutland. No, the Royal Navy's legacy of World War One is frustration, because the enemy fleet was in harbour and they couldn't get to them because they wouldn't come out. So the Royal Navy basically spends the next 20 odd years developing systems, which means you can no longer hide in harbour from us.
Well, they had plans at the end of World War One. If the war had gone on for a few more months, they were going to do a mass torpedo strike on the high seas fleet anyway.
Yes.
So
that was what the Sopwith Cuckoos for, and HMS Furious, and all these things were being developed for. This is the Royal Navy is almost, I would say, you are looking at the Navy, which is probably most obsessed with this as an issue, and that's possibly one of the reasons why they are so capable of, at this point, in that sort of circumstance, of dealing with both the high-tech and the low-tech solutions, what's best works, because they are so focused on, the object isn't to have the most high-tech piece of equipment. The object is to complete this mission.
So here we are. Admiral Cunningham's got a nice shiny new toy straight out of the shipyards, HMS Illustrious, and I get the sense to some degree that Cunningham has got a sense of showmanship. He wants to launch an attack on Taranto on Trafalgar Day, but things go wrong. Unfortunately, while clanging around in the hangar aboard HMS Illustrious, getting the Swordfish fitted with their 2 different varieties of fuel tank, a mechanic slips over and drops his hammer. His hammer sparks when it strikes the ground and sets off fuel fumes, which is not a good thing to do in an enclosed space. So we have a fire in the forward hangar of Illustrious, and the hangar curtains all fall down. The high pressure sprays kick in. Damage is nowhere near as bad as it could have been in terms of the fire damage, because only a couple of aircraft gets written off. But the problem is that these high pressure sprays douse all the aircraft in the hangar with salt water. So all of those Swordfish and Fulmars had to be pulled completely apart, dried out, all their connections oiled and greased, and put back together again. So the grand statement of attacking on Trafalgar Day is just simply not viable.
I actually have a theory of why Cunningham wanted to attack on Trafalgar Day. Every single Italian admiral he met in the 1930s was obsessed with showing him their copies of whatever the latest book about Admiral Nelson was available at the time. I think by 1940, he just wanted to stop them reading about Nelson. And I think he thought if he made that day a dark day in the history of the Italian Navy, they would stop showing him their collection of books. Because he does tell the story of, at one point, and it's in his excellent autobiography, which is A Sailor's Odyssey, this one. He talks about, this Italian admiral goes, "Oh, Cunningham, you've got to come with me. Andrew, come with me." And takes him to his bedroom to show that he has a pile of Nelson books on his bedside table in his bedroom on his warship. And Cunningham would rather not see the inside of Italian admiral's bedroom. He really isn't interested. And B, he's in there going, why is that the important thing you brought me in here to show me? So I think his entire plan, for the reason he wanted it done, on Trafalgar Day was it lined it up with the phase of the moon, but also make Trafalgar Day a dark memory for the Italians, so they stop taking me into their bedrooms.
Psychological warfare, not showmanship.
I think it was part showmanship, but also showmanship for the people at home, but psychological warfare for the people he was against.
Anyway, so very quickly after that, HMS Illustrious issues a new order. Only rubber hammers allowed in the hangar.
Yeah. And that goes fleet-wide. That's actually really quite critical. That idea goes fleet-wide. But also what they find interesting is, again, with that order, is they go back to 1932, and there is a standards order produced by the then staff of the Rear Admiral aircraft carriers, which does make that recommendation, but was not endorsed by the Admiralty.
Well, I guess, it's a common theme of our discussions that you either learn these lessons or you have to relearn them. And how many times do you really have to go through learning them before you actually learn it?
But there is also a reason why they suddenly found they did have a load of those hammers which was suitable and not that equipment which is suitable, because while Third Sea Lord, Henderson got it all built. It had them all done and all the stocks. They just were stockpiled and they were being stored rather than used because it was worried they would perish quickly. So they had all these things in case it became necessary because of tempo of operations, but they were sitting in warehouses. Even in Alexandria.
But, the cause of all this was the Swordfish's deadly torpedo configuration tank, fuel tank. So if it was carrying a torpedo, it had a big tank slotted into the observer compartment, the middle seat of the aircraft. If it was carrying bombs, well, the area under the fuselage was free, so it carried a more traditional sort of torpedo-shaped fuel tank. But to the cockpit were, let's just say they're a bit like the flimsy. The British-designed fuel tanks taken to the North African campaign, and which are pretty much the reason why everyone now uses jerry cans.
And this is why I think that actually the bravest people in World War II are the observers who were on the torpedo-carrying Swordfish flying into Taranto, especially the ones who decided to also open up with their machine gun firing tracers. The reason I say this is because many of them were waist deep or more in aviation fuel because of the way the cockpit was designed in the Swordfish. It's sort of in two buckets. There's a bucket for the pilot, and there's a bucket for the observer and the telegraphist air gunner who sits at the rear. And if the fuel tank is put in, it goes in the observer's seat, and the observer goes in the telegraphist air gunner's seat, and also has to man the gun at the back as well as doing the observer role. And, well, how do I put this? They were literally swimming in aviation fuel and firing a tracer machine gun.
Have either of you
with
been...
tracer being coming against them?
Have either of you been in a Swordfish?
I've been next to a Swordfish.
I've been next to one. I haven't been allowed to get inside one yet.
I'm
they're worried I might borrow it.
I'm just wondering whether you could actually sort of, perhaps for scientific reasons, of course, research reasons, just find out how much fluid stays in the back cockpit for how long. It doesn't necessarily have to be flammable, but fill it up and you can have one of these Swordfish baths. So the next full moon comes too quickly, so they can't get Illustrious up and running and the air group up and running in time for the next full moon.
They're basically rebuilding the entire air group from scratch. Let's be honest, this is something the Royal Navy likes to do anyway due to salt water, so they're quite practiced at it. But they are pretty much rebuilding, and this is something which you cannot overstate, because we've had, on normal Bilgepumps, we've had a guy on called Steve George to talk about the engineering feats of the air engineering organizations to support the squadrons and air engineering officers and all the fleet air arm personnel involved in the Falklands War. You cannot overstate how big a feat of engineering it is to get the whole air group fixed, flying, capable of operations in the time they take. Yes, it takes longer than they'd have liked, but honestly, the fact they managed to do it with the personnel they have available, the facilities they have available, is frankly amazing. It's a feat of engineering.
Elite engineers. That's what you need.
Mm.
What you need is an SAS of engineers.
The SES, Special Engineering Service.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
the SFS, Special Fix-It Service.
Well, this takes us back to the interwar years where the Royal Navy didn't have its own aero engineers. And that was a reason why you have the issues with some of the development of aircraft you do have. And you wonder, when you consider what the air engineers that get up to, that are part of the fleet area, that mostly have come from the Royal Air Force, but are now put into the Royal Navy command structure and now giving the Royal Navy, feeding up information. When you see what they managed to accomplish in things like this event, you wonder what the impact of having those personnel as part of the fleet during the interwar years might have been on the aircraft available, on the designs going through. You think about that.
Now, while this is all going on, they are busily preparing for the raid. They know they need to know what they're facing. They need to know what needs to be done and how it's done. Admiral Cunningham's all very keen and very enthusiastic. He's not as reticent as Pound was to the potential losses, although he was very much the same in expecting heavy losses. He felt that was necessary at this time, the point of the war. He was inspired by what Ark Royal had done just a couple of weeks earlier when it attacked the battle cruiser Dunkirk in Iran Harbour, 6 swordfish amid the mud banks, managed to get a few worthwhile hits. So he was dead keen for it to go ahead. So what happens is he puts in a formal request to the Royal Air Force to use their wonderful brand spanking new Maryland fast bombers based on Malta to go do a few reconnaissance flights over Taranto, which the RAF duly does. But once it does it, it doesn't want to hand over the photos because they're top secret.
Yes, so the Navy nixed them.
Yes, well, you see, while they did allow one of Cunningham's staff to have a look at the photos, and he was allowed to take notes from looking at the photos, but the photos weren't allowed to leave the secure room. But I think that this particular staff officer used his initiative to carry a reasonably large book into the large room with him and leave again with that reasonably large book containing a few extra pages. And those pages were, of course, the recon photos. So he rushes them to Illustrious, gets Illustrious's photo room to be busy all night taking copies, and he sneaks back in the morning, puts them back where they belong, so the RAF knows no better.
And a couple of times what he actually does is when he's replacing the old ones, he's using them to fill up the space of the new ones. So even if they go back and do a quick flick through, they won't realise. And he does all sorts of... It's really quite clandestine. This officer gets up to a lot in World War II in terms of getting stuff of the RAF. It's an ongoing issue for the Royal Navy. I'll look up his name. I was also having the same issue. I was hoping Drac would remember the name because it was in our notes, yes, but I've forgotten it.
The point is, this actually turned out to be quite critical because while they're looking at those photos, they notice a few white blobs, and those white blobs are a fairly significant issue. They could be barrage balloons.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the Italians used a system of barrage balloons where they had small boats or lighters strung out through the harbour. They'd have one cable holding that barrage balloon, and that barrage balloon would have 2 or 3 extra cables dangling beneath it as well. So they were definitely not something you wanted to fly into. Not just a swordfish being made out of a bit of string and a bit of wire and a bit of balsa wood.
The thing was, though, the barrage balloons had been set up distances which was fine for dealing with land-based aircraft, which tend to have slightly wider wingspans than carrier-based aircraft, which of course need to fold them and put them away. The Swordfish's wingspan, though, was, if they managed to line up right, would be okay getting through between the wires. That was the hope in theory, anyway.
Well, yes, that was a theory. There's a little bit to go into the effect. We'll mention it once we get to that point. But the point is that they needed to discover these so they could prepare for these things, so that they could warn the pilots and come up with some sort of idea as to how to avoid them.
Lieutenant David Pollock was the young officer. He was a solicitor in civilian life and a Royal Navy volunteer reservist who specialised in photographic interpretation on joining the Royal Navy. Basically, in David Ragg's book, made a great show of marking the dispositions of ships and defences on a map of Taranto, and then when his RAF counterpart was not looking, promptly borrowed the photographs and returned to his ship. The RAF never realised the subterfuge, as the photographs were copied in the carrier's photographic section and replaced the next day. The copies were taken to Lister and Boyd, who then poured over them stereoscopic lenses.
Yes. But again, what's with the RAF? I mean, how did the Royal Navy upset them so badly?
They existed.
They took the fleet air arm off them. It's going to sound strange, but honestly, you have to remember that quite a lot of the RAF, especially the bits associated with the bomber command, in terms of the staff and the senior officers, I'm not talking about the people running the squadrons or flying the aircraft. A lot of them had come through the period in the interwar years where it was bombers or battleships. And they were very much of the school that the bombers were better than the battleships, and the bombers would bomb everything, and you didn't need a fleet, and you didn't need all this stuff. And of course, reality would show you need both. But there were hardliners on both sides who just wouldn't concede, even the whole way through World War II.
It's not just Japan and the US that had pig-headed attitudes or behaviours among their staff. I mean, look, Admiral Lister had commissioned these recon flights, but he wasn't allowed to see what they produced.
Yes, Cunningham and Lister had commissioned it, and they weren't being allowed to see it.
It boggles the mind. But nevertheless, thanks to a little bit of creative, shall we say, filing, the problem was
I wouldn't be surprised if Lieutenant Pollock was at all assisted by possibly the junior RAF officer in charge of the actual photographic section. I wouldn't be surprised if they turned a big blind eye to the ones actually sitting in the room. It's the senior higher-ups who are making the decisions who are being like this. It's like when we were talking about Casper John earlier and his trip to America as part of the WWII group with Bomber Harris. Bomber Harris kept insisting that as a naval officer, Casper John didn't know what he was talking about. And at one point, the Americans were asking, if you want to do a test flight in this aircraft, we have to see your logbooks. And it turned out Casper John had twice as many flight hours as Bomber Harris. So, and Casper John hadn't said anything to him at all. They only realised this when they get the logbooks out to see if they are allowed to fly the aircraft and test fly the aircraft. And Bomber Harris isn't allowed, because Bomber Harris is considered not to have enough time to be able to just quickly jump in the aircraft and give it a fly. Whereas he takes it up. And I think it's on single-seat aircraft, not multiple. It's not all cumulative aircraft or all sort of things, but they were talking, I think, about single-seat aircraft. And it's just, you sit there and go, okay, but but you sit there and listen to the stories, and you're thinking, why are you saying this? And it's not. What's interesting is Casper John doesn't note it down. Casper John almost expects it. What's interesting is this reports of this is from the Americans, who are talking about the petty squabbling going on between the RAF and the Navy, and how the RAF officer keeps picking on the Navy officer. And there's a senator who writes to the British ambassador about it. And you sit there and listen and go, why? You look like children.
Politics. Anyway, so they've got November 11 is the next full moon, the next ideal date. And preparations are afoot. I suppose this is the point where we sort of need to look at what they're up against, dissect Taranto itself. So it's quite an interesting harbour, divided into two parts. It's the outer, more open area is the deep water harbour where the battleships are based. There's a very narrow channel between two promontories that leads to an inner lagoon, I suppose, is one way to describe it, which is where you find all your cruisers, light cruisers, some heavy cruisers, destroyers, torpedo boats, submarines, all nice and neatly lined up in tight groups, as well as a seaplane base. And along one of these peninsulas is a row of fuel tanks to supply the ships of the fleet, specifically with the fuel line running down to the battleship area most significantly. And basically a perimeter along the islands and the mole of anti-aircraft emplacements, anti-aircraft barges. There's a string of balloons up along the peninsula where the fuel tanks are. There's also a few balloons scattered through the entrances of the harbour as well, moored to lighters, small boats, I suppose. So not as many of them as there could have been, because a rather nasty storm goes through and knocks the numbers from about 90 down to about 20, I think. They simply got blown away or torn up or broken off. And the other thing about Taranto Harbour is that while the Italian Navy had estimated they needed something like 13, 14 kilometres worth of torpedo netting, they'd only managed to acquire 7 kilometres and deploy about 4 or 5. Some of it had been tangled up and had been pulled out to be untangled after the same storm. So the torpedo netting was there. But the other thing about the torpedo netting that was there was it only went down to a certain depth, about 30 feet, because they were convinced that no torpedo would be effective if it was running any deeper, because, let's face it, that's how deep the drafts of the ships were in that harbour. So that left a relatively shallow, but still a definite gap between the bottom of the torpedo and the bottom of the harbour. This is where the duplex pistols came in. You could set them to run a bit deeper than usual, admittedly after not diving too deep on their initial entry into the water. And then they could scoot along underneath the hull of a warship, sense its presence, and then do their thing.
This is where you get into an interesting discussion, because the Royal Navy does know how deep that net goes. They know it goes down to 30 feet, and that's why they're sending this off at 33 feet. The interesting thing is, there's a very strong discussion, and I've been through all of Andrew Boyd's British naval intelligence through the 20th century, and haven't found it in there, of where they get that information from. How do they, this is the thing, it's not something you're going to be able to see really from a photographic reconnaissance, how deep or how the net goes. You might see it stretched out on land and be able to get a rough approximation. That's not going to really help you much. So the question is, where do they get it from?
Mm.
And my thinking is because they've seen it in the interwar period, and it's been the same net the Italians were using in interwar period, And during one of their visits, a Royal Navy officer has taken a nice wander up to it and has given a rough estimate of it. Or possibly, more practically, a Chief Petty Officer wandered up there who no one takes any notice of because they're a Chief Petty Officer.
So, yeah, look, I mean, the British were well prepared.
Yeah.
I think it's fair to say that they hadn't really missed anything here. There was, the Italians didn't have radar, but they did have a sound detection system. So they had an array of essentially giant mechanical tubes strung out along the coast.
Yeah.
And they were designed to hear the engines of anything from an aircraft through to a ship and give at least a degree of last-minute warning. They weren't necessarily, they were definitely by no means a replacement for radar, but I think even the British used some sound domes, didn't they, along the coast to pick up the engines.
There's still a few around. Big concrete dishes.
So
yeah,
they did have some form of early warning. And of course, they had they had a very heavy anti-aircraft defense. So it's not as though it was unprotected by any means, and they were also not going to be surprised because they were at war. So the 1935 and 1938 battle plans were for a surprise attack, either as a preemptive attack on Taranto or for an attack on the day that war was declared.
There's surprise, though, and there is surprise. There is strategic surprise when you come out of the blue, a la Pearl Harbor, September 11, all those ones, when you weren't expecting it. And there is operational surprise. And you have to think that the Italians were feeling pretty secure in Taranto. They hadn't really been attacked at this point there. They didn't think the British would come for them. They thought they'd be able to they'd see if they get plenty of warning of the British coming, because the idea was the reconnaissance aircraft would see them coming and the fleet would steam out and attack them, and all these things were sort of going on. There were so many layers that they thought they had. It's not so a case of surprise as in strategic surprise. Oh, I'm shocked we were attacked, but there is I'm shocked we were attacked out the blue because surely we'd have seen it coming. And I think that's the level you get at Taranto. You get this sort of, we've been attacked.
They should have felt prepared because they had 21 dual-purpose 4-inch guns. They had 84 20mm Raiders and 109 13.2mm machine guns. So these are a mixture of single and twin mounts spaced evenly around the harbour. So they had good firepower and they had good firepower coverage. They had swathes of searchlights, and this is all before you start to take into account the equipment on board the ships themselves. So, I mean, Drac, you probably know the anti-aircraft arrangement of the Italian fleet better than I do, but one of the things that is often overlooked about the Italian fleet while it was in Taranto was that they were permanently on 50% of anti-aircraft mounts to be manned at any one time, and at dawn and dusk it was to be 100% of secondary armament manned. So it wasn't as though they'd all gone to bed. They had 50% of their weapons operational and manned at any time.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with the Italian fleet AA was that, as with an awful lot of Italian naval technology, to be perfectly honest, on paper it was absolutely wonderful. On paper, they had some of the heaviest AA on their modern ships of anybody, but in practice there were a lot of operational issues. So, for example, like the 90mm gun, that was the sort of the heavy anti-aircraft guns. Remember, the Italians didn't go in for the dual-purpose mountings like the American 5-inch or the British 5.25. If you look at the Vittorio Veneto and Littorio, they've got triple 6-inch secondaries and then this battery of 90mm AA. The 90mm gun in and of itself is a superb weapon. It's got very long range, very high muzzle velocity, very accurate. In fact, in a lot of ways, it's actually superior to the much talked about German 88mm. But both it and the Italian medium AA are all mounted in very complex, very theoretically capable stabilized mountings. And they're tri-stabilized, so they're designed to keep the guns completely level, accurate, etc. Just whatever the ship's doing, whether it's pitching, rolling, vibrating, jumping up and down, etc. But the mountings themselves keep breaking down and jamming, and as you can probably appreciate, if you've got a triaxially stabilized mount, if one of those axes stops working or throws itself slightly out of alignment, it throws everything else out of alignment. Because it's one thing if you're on an AA gun, if you can feel the ship moving around you, you can compensate to that to a certain extent. Obviously having a stabilized mount is better, but if you're in a stabilized mount where one or more of the axes has given up, you're now in a situation where really you want to be straight and level. You can feel the ship moving in one direction, but your gun mount is now moving in a completely different direction because it'll be compensating for one part of your movement and not the other. And okay, so that's less of an issue when you're moored in harbour, but it does mean that when the mountings break down completely, or obviously they have to be manually aimed, and they're not used to that. But yeah, generally the Italian gun mountings themselves are very overly complex, and as a result, the effectiveness of their AA does suffer generally. Specific guns can be very accurate. Specific ships can be very accurate if they're having a good day and the systems are actually working. But it's a little bit of a potluck, and then you combine that with a night attack, where, as you said, they're on duty, but they're on duty night after night.
Yes.
Week after week, month after month. Eventually that breeds lethargy. It's a nice point. It's like, yes, you're supposed to be on duty, but let's face it, if you're in an enclosed 90mm mount and the officers are probably having a snooze on the bridge, no one's really going to come looking to see if you're having a quick sleep. So it becomes a good opportunity to catch up on rest, and you're just not in that mindset anymore after a while. It's the fatigue.
But at the very least, you should be near your gun. And your gun should be adequately supplied with ready-use ammunition.
Yes.
So that you can wake up and be effective, unlike, say, what happens a few months later at Pearl Harbor. Yeah. So I think it's fair to say that Taranto was a fully armed and operational Death Star naval harbor.
Battle station.
Yeah. So this is what the Swordfish are going
now
up against.
becoming quite scary. Although, actually, I think the Swordfish would have done better than the X-Wings versus the Death Star. I just think they would, because let's be honest, the Death Star crews would have all been going, "What is coming at us?"
Lasers just poking little holes.
I think that little flunky was there in both universes. The one that runs up to the Admiral and says, These fighters are too small for our defences.
And I think the only other thing I'll say about the Italian fleet AA is that for all the faults at Pearl Harbor, at least the American battleships are all lined up. Yes, it makes them a target, but it does mean that at least for the battleships that are more up, if a torpedo strike's coming in or whatever, the entire AA broadside of that battleship and all the battleships in that row can engage over relatively open sites, whereas if you look at the layout of the Italian battleships at Taranto, there is a certain logic to it as far as the harbour conditions are concerned, but geometrically, it's a complete and utter mess, which means that, especially if you're dealing with a low-level torpedo strike aircraft, if you're an Italian AA gunner on a battleship, not only do you have to worry about potentially shooting down the aircraft that's coming at you, you also have to worry about, but depending on which side of the ship you're on and which ship in particular you're on, any shots that go long might go into the town, or any shots that go long might hit other friendly ships. And
even some shots which go short might hit for other friendly ships.
So if you're that's going to be staying your hand on the trigger slightly, because you might have your 90mm AA broadside ready to go full bore, but if your commander's thinking, yes, but if we get this slightly wrong, we're basically going to be lobbing several hundred pounds of high explosive in a couple of minutes straight into our own harbour town, you're going to be erring on the side of aiming slightly high or holding your fire until you're absolutely certain that you're going to hit. And in the kind of confines of a harbour, even things like the smaller medium caliber and even machine gun rounds will still fly long.
And that very much does become a factor of the subsequent attack, but we'll get into that as it unfolds. So now we're up to the point of the operation. As part of Operation Judgment is the mission, is the name of the air raid against Taranto. It's part of a very large movement of convoys and warships through the entire Mediterranean called Operation Mike Bravo 8. This is Cunningham doing his thing. He very much likes to confuse his opponent by having lots of things happening in lots of places at the same time to mask his real intentions. So he has convoys going from Egypt to Crete. He has convoys going from Egypt to Greece. He has convoys going from Egypt to Malta. He has convoys and forces moving from Gibraltar to Malta. And he has forces moving from Gibraltar to Alexandria. So he has hundreds of ships moving all at once, all across the Mediterranean, and all sort of getting close to the Malta area at roughly the same time. So it would have been incredibly difficult for an Italian admiral sitting back watching the reports coming in from his flying boats, his submarines, and his, shall we say, radio-equipped fishing fleet as to what these ships were doing and where they were going.
There is, and the more they plan Taranto and the more they get involved, there is a worry going through the Admiralty staff that the overflights by the reconnaissance aircraft might tip off their hand, but also that the Air Force might decide those are some very tempting targets we're going to have a go. And it's a case of, it's a legacy of the bomber versus battleship and bomber versus aircraft carrier and bomber versus pretty much everything else debates in the 1920s and 30s. You have people even sort of thinking this because it had got so entrenched and so vendetta-full on both. And these are good officers. They're not bad officers. Please, I'm not saying they are bad officers. And I'm saying that they are so caught up in their view because they all want to serve their country as best they can, and they believe fundamentally in their core that the best weapon system to protect their country is what they are doing. It's either the bomber or it's the battleship or the aircraft carrier, or all these things. That's where it comes from. It's not out of a selfish desire for self-aggrandizement, although there are probably a couple of officers who are like that. Most of them, it's out of an earnest desire to protect their country, and they think that's the best way. And that's one of the reasons why the fighting has been so fierce and the argument's so fierce, and also why there are these sort of worries. And as Jamie has said, it does thoroughly confuse the Italians. But there's also another problem for the Italians, in that there was a study done during World War II of aircraft which came back and where they had bullet holes, where aircraft which came back had bullet holes. And they were looking at it and going, well, these must be the places that we have to put armor. Until an engineer pointed out, a very clever engineer pointed out, that actually these were the places where the aircraft, if they got shot, managed to get back. The spaces which looked like they hadn't been impacted were the places where if an aircraft got shot, they didn't get back. So it was those places which should actually have to be armored. In this example, the Italian Admiral and the Italian High Command are receiving information of movements of certain fleet groups, but some fleet groups, like those which have aircraft carriers in, i.e. Ark Royal or Illustrious, are doing a very good job of shooting down reconnaissance aircraft and of keeping submarines and other things under a tight lid, which means that they aren't getting that much information. In fact, they aren't getting that much information at all coming back. So what they're seeing is they're getting reports, and they're also losing aircraft, and they're presuming the aircraft being lost are something to do with those reports the aircraft that are getting from the aircraft that are getting through, and therefore that's where the British are, not thinking, hang on, we're not getting reports from these patches of ocean, so those are the patches of the ocean where the big British forces are.
Good point. Yes, interesting, because this whole Mike Bravo 8 operation begins on November 4. That's when the first convoy's set to sea. Whereas Force A itself, this is Cunningham's fleet from Alexandria. Force A is HMS Illustrious, Warspite, Valiant, Malaya, and Ramillies, and a whole heap of destroyers, D, H, J class, with one tribal chucked in there, I think, Mohawk. Mm-hmm. Illustrious, of course, is set out to sea without Eagle, because Eagle just hasn't been able to get that fuel system fixed. And you really don't want to be getting bombed when you've got leaking fuel. And the Royal Navy learned that very early with one of its carriers. His name was it Bond. Keep forgetting the name of that carrier that blew up in World War One.
Oh, Ben Sherry.
Yes, that's right. So that basically is, for want of a better pun, burnt the need for fire safety into the psyche of British carrier ops for eternity, I think. But point being, Eagle donated 6 of her Swordfish and 8 of her crews to Illustrious, and as well as 2 Sea Gladiators, just to complement the 15 Formars on board, because they knew that, yes, the fighters were just as important for this operation as the Swordfish were.
And let's be honest, those Sea Gladiators were actually lusted over by some of the Illustrious crew, because they were very nimble and they'd been doing all sorts of naughty things to the fleet while being in it. Yes, we talk about their fighting, but also the Sea Gladiators were very, very nimble. And at one point, how do I put it? They'd started to make a sport of managing to, as they called it, roll over Warspite. So they'd fly up very close on one side and then flip the aircraft up and over. And by the time it got over the other side, it would go the full way around and then fly on, literally fly up one side and then fly away on the other side. So from port to starboard was more annoying, and all sorts of things. So they were lusted over by the Illustrious air crew, and I'm fairly sure some of the Fulmar and Swordfish pilots from the HMS Illustrious's air group managed to get a turn in them.
I think they would have been somewhat envious of the Sea Gladiator's rate of climb, to be honest.
Oh, that was also good.
Anyway, so these 2 Sea Gladiators were deck parks, because I don't think they had folding wings. They actually took effective part in suppressing the reconnaissance of the Italians. They were involved in 1 or 2 of the shoot-downs. So, again, it's not necessarily, you don't need the best, you just need something that's going to work. November 7, Force H, Force F leave Gibraltar. So Force H is Ark Royal, of course, and her best mate, HMS Sheffield, one of those ships that didn't get damaged during the war. And 8 destroyers.
I was trying to remember which town class didn't get damaged through the war. I was mentally going for the head, and for some reason Sheffield didn't turn up in my brain.
Shiny Chef was pretty much unscratched, I think.
Did get a bit of splinter damage at the North Cape, but no direct hits.
And Force F was actually HMS Barham, along with Berwick, Glasgow, and a bunch of G-class destroyers that were transiting from the east, from the west to the eastern Mediterranean to help reinforce the fleet in Alexandria. So you've got this massive convergence of convoys, warships, all zeroing in down on Malta.
And you've also got, this is something else which we should talk about in sort of context. And it's one of my favourite parts of this operation is Operation Coat, which goes on, which I know Jamie's going to be getting to in a second. But the Ark Royal managed to send some free Fulmars transferring to Illustrious via Malta from Ark Royal. And that's just something cool to carry out. Let's be honest. When we're talking about modern fleet operations, the ability to transfer aircraft from one carrier to another, even via land bases, sort of for a quick fuel up, is a pretty cool thing to have in your arsenal. To actually be able to range it and do it and have the navigational ability to do it. And you couldn't have done that with a single-seat fighter. At that time, they wouldn't have had a navigational ability.
And it gave Illustrious 18 Fulmars.
And 2 Gladiators.
Yep. So she had this is when they say that the Royal Navy didn't have deck parks. Well, this is where Illustrious had deck parks, not just of the Gladiators, but also of the Fulmars, because there just simply wasn't enough space.
Didn't they also have those little things which I always forget? They're sort of various responses which run off the side, which they can put the tail hooks onto, the tail wheel onto, and they can sort of wheel the aircraft out halfway over the side. I forget what they're called. Drac. Come on, Drac, you're our technical whiz.
He's
torturing him as well.
It'll come to us in a minute.
Oh.
Outriggers?
Yes.
Outriggers.
Yeah, look, you see them throughout the entire war. There's a great photo of HMS Formidable after she'd been hit by a kamikaze, where there's a Corsair just slung out over the side in front of the bridge, sitting there nice and neatly while the deck burns. So those outriggers were there for the duration for the Royal Navy. They had smaller flight decks because they were smaller ships. Ark Royal also sent 9 swordfish bombers out on a mission. Out against
Cagliari.
Tagliatelle.
Airbase.
But this is the interesting thing about this one was that these swordfish weren't out to bomb bombers and fighters. They were out to hit the reconnaissance hangars. So they were hitting the aircraft that could do the most damage to this operation, the ones that could find the fleet, track the fleet, tell the powers that be where the fleets are going. So these 9 swordfish managed to wreck these hangars quite thoroughly and to take out a bunch of aircraft.
And always what I find interesting is when you're talking to people, the amount of people in current days who think the idea of blinding your enemy, of taking out their reconnaissance assets, their intelligence assets, is something new. And you go, no, we've been doing it since time immemorial. It's a fairly basic and obvious thing to do.
And most people don't realise that swordfish were busily doing this sort of thing as well as putting torpedoes into the stern of the Bismarck.
Yes.
So, it's not like they were a one-shot wonder by any means,
And this is the other thing. When I hear people going, oh, the swordfish was a terrible aircraft, it was a biplane, I'm going, do you realise all the things the swordfish managed to accomplish in World War II? And basically become the model, the basis on foundational operation of what we expect modern anti-submarine warfare helicopters to do as well.
Again, you work with what you've got and you find a use for what you've got. And the swordfish was able to change roles, which, again, that its name is absolutely ideal. String bag, you know. You can use a string bag to do anything. It can be giant, it can be small. You can tuck it in your pocket, but you can carry a watermelon in it. So, you know, the nickname is certainly very appropriate for this particular aircraft. So at the same time, these raids were part of a diversion for Force A, but also a diversion for Operation Crack, not the hallucinogenic kind, but Crack of the Whip. This is where Force H and Force F dash through the Sicilian Channel at night. So, you know, once again, it's a situation where the Italians know that these ships are going through the channel, but they just don't know exactly when and exactly where. So despite the fact of having all these torpedo boats all ready to make a move, Barham and the cruisers get through without any problem. But again, it's because of the confusion that they hadn't managed to properly position to monitor those channels, because they were too busy worried about what was happening a few dozens of kilometers elsewhere. And you know, to be able to push through ships of this size and value at this stage of the fight in the Mediterranean was a pretty risky business, but it paid off.
And if you're an Italian admiral and you hear that that's happened or see that that's happened, you're going to think that was the coup de main of the operation. You're going to think that was the principal reason for it. You're going to think that's a big thing to have accomplished, and that's what this was all about. That's why they were taking out my reconnaissance aircraft. That's why they were doing this, to get that through, because that is a big thing. The fact that Cunningham is going to go even bigger, and that's just the sideshow to what he's trying to do, well, or rather, that's just one small facet of what the whole maelstrom of things that Cunningham is trying to achieve at the same time is neither here nor there. If you're an Italian admiral and you see that Barham's got through, that's a big thing.
And you know, at the same time, you've got the illustrious group Force A, sort of taken up position some 200 miles east of Malta, creating a blind spot. So the Fulmars and Sea Gladiators were knocking down pretty much every Italian reconnaissance aircraft. Admittedly, you know, most of these aircraft are seaplanes, so they're not really fast flying or high flying, but they were armed and they had a job to do. But the Fulmars were more than capable of countering them, and so were the Sea Gladiators. They basically ensure that by the time November 9 comes around, the Italian leaders have got no real idea what the hell is going on at all. So they're not able, so they don't send their ships at Taranto to sea, because they don't know where the target is or what the best target's going to be, or whether it's a high risk or a low risk. They just know there's a lot of things happening. The Italian Air Force's bomber fleets are not really being put out to much effect because they haven't got specific targeting information. There's a lot of water. It's not easy to find your target over water, particularly at this stage of the war, but even at any stage of the war, really. So everything's going extremely well. But come November 9, Illustrious loses 2 of her swordfish. Now, this is a problem when you've only got 24 swordfish, because 2 out of that amount is just a little bit less than 10%. So they're not panicking at this point, but I guess this is the thing. You know, this is where criticism of the armoured flight decks does actually make a valid point. They only have limited air groups. They can't sustain operational losses for long. So here are 2 lost swordfish.
But to be fair, the British have been working to A, HMS Unicorn, and B, the moment the treaties are over, these ships start to grow in size. But they maintain their armoured flight decks because if you're the British and you're fighting in the Mediterranean, there are increased odds of chance of getting attacked. If you're fighting in the North Atlantic, well, actually having the flight deck as your strength deck as an armored deck actually makes the ship far more stronger and far able to deal with the weather and the operations it's going to be facing in the North Atlantic and the South Atlantic. And if you're fighting in the Pacific, you're the other side of the world from your industrial base. So having a ship which is more survivable and can take more damage and keep on operating means you're less likely to keep having to have the ships come back to the other side of the world to get repaired. Because there aren't major repair facilities in Australia that can repair a whole carrier. There aren't major repair facilities in India that can repair a whole carrier, or Singapore. They can do temporary fix jobs, but to get them properly repaired, they would have had to come back to the UK, which is a long way away if they're planning on fighting war in the Pacific, because they can't presume they're going to have access to American yards the other side of the Pacific. So for the British, there is a reason for having this armoured deck. It's
but there is also
built in
that
the
trade-off,
context.
isn't there? Though.
Yes, there is a trade-off.
And
there's a trade-off
is,
in all these things.
Yes, yes, of course, and it's starting to make itself noticed here. That on November 9, they're starting to worry about swordfish, because it's these swordfish aren't just sitting on deck doing nothing. These swordfish are flying off to provide reconnaissance for Italian ship movements. They're flying off to provide anti-submarine cover, and they're also flying off to provide communications. So, one of them flies off to Malta to get, yes, you guessed it, photographs. So these aircraft are needed constantly, and they're not just sitting there waiting for their one shot. Look, and again, here's November 8 is a classic example of the Fulmar's use as a cat fighter. So 15 aircraft from 15 SM-79 tri-motors detected approaching 12,000 feet. They were detected, by radar, giving the fleet 15 or so minutes warning. So the Fulmars were able to get into position. Admittedly, it was only a couple, 2 or 3 of it, Fulmars, but they managed to tangle this flight of 15 bombers and disrupt it, shoot one of them down, and the others were forced to jettison their bombs or evade, and therefore none of them made it over the fleet. So, again, the criticism against the Fulmar at this point of the war is not justified, because it was doing things that, weren't really even repeated later in the war. How many times were there that flights of 15 bombers intercepted by 2 to 3 aircraft would do better than that? Not often, I would say. So they had the right aircraft in the Swordfish, they had the right aircraft in the Fulmar at the right time, which is Taranto.